Hey folks, Aaron Gray here with the first part of Chapter 1 in Probability and Statistics. An introduction, terms, and what I like to call sample, 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 because sampling is extremely important. Well, what's so special about probability and statistics anyway, other than the fact that you have to take this course for some reason or another? Well, we can answer that question by asking another question. What is statistics? Uppercase, because I'm talking about the subject. And a good definition is the science or the math of data. Well, what are data? Data are collections of observation. If you can observe it and write it down, what you write down, the recording of it, that's data. Well, why do we care? Well, data is everywhere, especially in the world we live in. We have a data deluge or data overload wherever we are here in the world as it is nowadays. The internet is at our fingertips. We can find information and data in less than a second. Well, probability and statistics helps us make sense of that data. It helps us interpret that data and helps us gather information from that data. So as data becomes more and more democratized, probability and statistics becomes even more important as a means to understand and interpret data. That's why it's special. Well, data can be used to make a point. Unfortunately, data are often misused or presented in misleading ways. Yeah, if you watch television, a lot of times you see people on television quoting data, and some of that data is good data, numbers and studies, research that's been done. But sometimes data is misused, whether that's intentional or not. It can be mishandled, or it can be presented in a way that can be misleading, even if all the numbers are correct and presented as they really are. They can be presented in a way that misleads the viewer. Let's talk about how you find data. There are two major ways in this course, an observational study and an experiment. Now, in an observational study, characteristics are observed and measured, but they're not modified in any way. So you observe it and you record it, but you don't interact with what happens. This is kind of like in a Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. When Ebenezer Scrooge goes back in time, he can see what's going on, he can hear what's going on, but he cannot interact with what happens. Well, it's kind of like an observational study. We can observe it, but we do not interact. Now, in an experiment, on the other hand, there's absolutely interaction. Some sort of treatment is applied, and the effects are observed and measured. So maybe a new medical pill or maybe some kind of procedure is applied, and the effects are absorbed and or observed and recorded. That's an experiment. Now, the subjects of the experiment, the things or people or whatever it is that's having the experiment done on them, those are called experimental units. So let's do a couple of examples. We'll identify each of these as an observational study or an experiment. Number one, the Pew Research Center surveyed 2,252 adults and found that 95% of them go online wirelessly. Observational study or experiment. Well, the Pew Research Center is not applying any sort of treatment and then recording the results. They're simply asking 2,252 adults whether or not they go online wirelessly. So that would be an observational study. They're not actually performing any sort of experiment. And number two, over 200,000 children were given the Salk vaccine, while another over 200,000 children were given a placebo. The results were compared. Now, the Salk vaccine is the vaccine that prevents polio. And this is a true story. This actually happened. Now, placebo is a fake treatment. Well, since someone was given a vaccine, a treatment, and others were given a placebo, and the results were compared, we're interacting with the data. This is an experiment. It's actually the largest, or one of the largest, public health experiments in history. Well, let's talk about different types of studies. A cross-sectional study involves data that are observed, measured, and collected at one point in time. So you get a cross-section of the population or of what's going on. A retroactive or case control study involves data that are collected from the past by going back in time. Not literally, but you examine records, you look at archives and interviews, things like that. In a prospective or longitudinal or cohort study, data are collected in the future. Again, not literally. You share or you follow a cohort, which is a group that shares some common factor, over a long period of time, and you record what happens to that group of people to form a prospective or cohort study. Here are some other terms that may come up that are useful. Double-blind study. Have you ever heard that phraseology that's talking about how neither the experimental units, that's the ones being experimented on, nor the administrators, those are the ones doing the experiments, know who receives the treatment and who receives a placebo? Another good word is confounding. I've heard the phrase, "I'll confound it." Confounding happens when you do an experiment, but you're not able to tell whether the effects are from the experiment or from something else. So you're not able to distinguish between the effects of different factors. Well, what is it, my new medical treatment that cured this disease? Was it a genetics issue? Was diet involved somehow? That's confounding if you're not able to tell. It's not a good thing if you're doing research. Now, once a type of study is selected, the next step is to actually gather your data. So here are some more terms. A population is the complete collection of all measurements or data that are being considered. A census occurs if you collect data from every single member of a population. A sample occurs when you just take data from a subcollection of the population. So you don't take data from everything or everyone in the population, just a small subset or a smaller subset. Well, let's talk about these scenarios. We'll identify the sample or population involved in each. Number 3, the state of Tennessee sent a questionnaire to each of its residents to determine the state's most predominant religion. The population involved here are the residents of Tennessee. And every resident is getting a questionnaire. So we are trying to gather information from everyone in the population. And number 4, a survey of 36 teenagers at a local high school with an enrollment of over 500 was taken. It was found that 82% owned a cell phone. The population of interest in this scenario is the teenagers at a local high school. Well, this scenario doesn't ask every single teenager whether they have a cell phone. It only concerns 36 teenagers at this local high school. So, the 36 teenagers are the sample. That's part of the population. Number 5, a student finds that among all the math teachers in her school, 55% are left-handed. The population of interest is all the math teachers in this lady's school. And notice the word all. All is an important word. It almost always signifies the population that's being considered. So all and every, those are population words, and they should send up a red flag if you see them in a problem. Well, sometimes a census is not feasible. Remember, a census is when you gather information from every single member of a population. Well, maybe you don't have the time or the money or the help to do that. Well, instead, we'll just get the next best thing, a sample. Instead of asking everyone, we'll just ask part. A sampling method can greatly affect the data. It can even nullify the findings. Nullify means it can cancel them. It can make them worthless. So it's extremely important to use sampling methods that are sound to ensure useful results. If you don't build a good foundation, then the rest of your findings and your research could be called into question and maybe even be pointless. So here are a few sampling types. One type is voluntary response sample or a self-selected sample. Now, that occurs when the respondents themselves decide to be included. In other words, the sample chooses itself. That's why it's voluntary. You've seen quite a bit of these, no doubt. Media call-in polls or internet polls, those are voluntary response samples. You're watching television and somebody says, hey, call us in or go on Facebook and tell us what you think. Well, the only people whose opinions are included in that sample are the ones who volunteer their opinion, who volunteer to be part of the sample. So that's voluntary response. Now, the bad news about voluntary response is that they're prone to attract extremes and are often used to support arguments. Well, if you think about it, most people who are going to be willing to volunteer their opinion on some issue are the ones that are either very much for or very much against. The people that are in the middle or even apathetic are unlikely to go through the trouble of volunteering their opinion. So these attract extremes, and unfortunately they're often used to support arguments. Well, I believe X, and all my viewers who watch me every week agree with me according to this poll that I had on my website. Well, of course, you have an extreme view, and those people who share your view are more likely to volunteer their view. So it's not a great sampling type. Sometimes that's the best you can do, but it's not great. Another type is a convenience sample. As the name implies, results are collected based on how easy they are to gather, how convenient they are to get. You see these occasionally as well on television and other places. Maybe a reporter is stationed at the mall food court or outside of a grocery store. And as people walk by, the TV reporter asks them how they feel about a certain issue, some current event. That's a convenient sample. The people who are in that sample are only in that sample because they were easy to find. They're convenient. A systematic sample occurs when you select a starting point and then you select every kth element of the population. And k would be a number. For example, with the illustration on this slide, let's say we'll start at the man on the left. And I randomly select the number 3. Well, all right, then 1, 2, 3. Third person from the left is in my sample. 1, 2, 3. The next third person's in my sample. 1, 2, 3, and so on until I go through the entire list. If I were to form a sample by going through a list of students, maybe I get one from the registrar, and put them in order, and then I randomly select maybe the number 52 and select every 52nd person on that list, that would be a systematic sample. I have a system, the first 6 letters. There's a system from which I can tell which people or which elements I want in my set. A stratified sample occurs when the population is divided into subgroups and then each subgroup is sampled. For example, as you can see on this slide, this population is split into women and men. So I split up between women and men, and maybe I select 3 of the women and select 3 of the men. And I can select those randomly. But each group gets representation. The women are represented and the men. Maybe I split them by age brackets, and every age bracket demographic gets representation. So you get some of every group. It's stratified. If you've had a sociology class, then you studied social stratification. That's a study of how people are split into different groups, whether they're socioeconomic or otherwise. Well, that's the idea with stratified sampling. A cluster sample is similar in that the population is divided into sections or clusters, but then the clusters are randomly selected and everyone in those clusters become part of the sample. You're not really choosing the people or the things on an individual basis, you're choosing the clusters. For example, voting precincts, if I split an area into voting precincts and then I randomly select the numbers 5, 16, and 28, well then I would interview everyone, all the voters in precinct 5, 16, and 28. So I get all of a few, all of some. Now stratified and cluster sampling are similar in that both are divided up, but a stratified sample involves members of every division, so you get some of all divisions. Cluster sample involves every member of just a few divisions. That's all of some of the divisions. So the difference is subtle, but they are different. Other types of sampling, well, there's also random sampling. Each individual member of the population has an equal chance to be selected, which is the definition of random. This would often be done with computer selection. One specific type of random sample is the simple random sample. Specifically, a sample of n subjects, n's a number, is selected in such a way that every possible sample of the same size has the same chance of being chosen. And the best illustration of that is picking names out of a hat. As long as the hat's names are shuffled sufficiently, if I were to choose 5 names out of a hat with 100 people in it or 100 names in it, that would be a simple random sample, because every combination of 5 people has the same probability of being chosen. Well, let's talk about the types of sample that are described in these scenarios. Number 6, quality control engineer selects every 12,000th hairdryer that's produced. That's a systematic sample because every 12,000th hairdryer is selected. Number 7, CBS News station in New York often obtains opinions by interviewing neighbors of a person who is the focus of a news story. That's a convenience sample. The station interviews people that are convenient to find. On the day of a presidential election, ABC News organized an exit poll in which specific polling stations were randomly selected and all voters were surveyed as they left the premises. The key word to watch for here is all. All of these voters are surveyed. But it's all voters that are at specific polling stations. This is a cluster sample. The people are not selected on an individual basis. The polling stations are selected, and then everyone there is part of the sample. Number 9, a number is assigned to each member of the House of Representatives. 60 of those numbers are randomly generated and selected. That is a simple random sample. It's not that much different than putting all the names of the members of the House of Representatives in a hat, shuffling that hat enough, and then picking 60 names out. Number 10, the U.S. is partitioned into 150 regions with 100 adults in each group. Then 10 people are randomly selected from each region. That's stratified. We divide the population into different groups, and then we take some of each group. Number 11, a local news station asks viewers to post their favorite local candidate on the station's Facebook wall. This is a voluntary response sample. The viewers who post their local candidate are the ones who volunteer to be in the sample. Well, if sample data are not collected in an appropriate way, or if the sample is not sufficiently large, the data may be so completely useless that no amount of statistical torturing can salvage them. In other words, if you don't have a good foundation, a good sampling technique, then anything that comes after that, any results that come from that sample, can be called into question, and they may be so completely useless and pointless. It doesn't matter what mathematical magic you try to do to them, they're not going to really tell you anything. So randomness and size are the keys to a good sample. The more random, the better. That removes bias, and it removes the researcher from the process. Puts it in the hands of randomness. Size is also very important. The larger the sample, the better. Now, ideally, we'd like to perform a census and get information from every member of a population, but often that is not feasible. So, we want to get as big a sample as possible. The bigger the sample, the better. In the next video, we'll talk about how to classify data once you have it.